This Torah class is brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.
Okay, Parshas Lecha. So we know the end of Parshas Noach discusses the debate between Avram Avinu and Nimrod, where ultimately Avram Avinu was thrown into the fire. But so that gave me a good excuse to speak about an interesting Spanish topic. So God willing, hope to be there in about 10 days. And we're going to speak about an epic episode in history, and it's an episode that I'm sure we're all familiar with on some level. I'm sure we've all heard of it, but I haven't really met anyone who studied the dispute in depth. So what I would like to share with you are some of the arguments that the Ramban used, and tonight's topic is really for a mature audience, because it's always a question whether a person should involve themselves in what's called ecumenical debates, because when you learn about questions that others have, you know, if a person's not necessarily a thinking person and they never thought of the question themselves, and now all of a sudden they're presented with the question, and they may not understand the answer fully, so it's not necessarily advantageous. So just giving you that disclaimer that this topic is most appropriate for those on who have a certain level of scholarship, which of course everybody here is on that level. So we made sure everybody passed the test when they entered. Okay, so let's begin the following way. In the end of the 12th century, beginning of the 13th century, the beginning of the 14th century, Spain was one of the centers of Torah Judaism. Many Rishonim lived in Spain. And, for example, from the Gedolei Rishonim, people don't realize they were from Sfarad, they were Sephardi. You have the Rashba, you have the Ritva, you have the Ra'ah. Now, who's the Ra'ah? Many attribute the Sefer HaChinuch to the Ra'ah. He probably did not write the Sefer HaChinuch. It was probably written by one of his Talmidim. You have the Ran, you have Rabbeinu Yoina. These are all Gedolei Sfarad. But it's interesting, and there's an amazing tshuva of the Ritva. The Ritva talks about the gadlus of Sfarad. The Ritva speaks about how the Rishonim in Sfarad and the Gedolim in Sfarad are different than Gedolim in any other area in the world. And that is, look what he writes in number 1, Be'emes, this is on the third line, Zehu Shvach Chachmei Artzenu. This is the praise of the sages of our land, referring to Sfarad. Shekibalnu Meiroya Echa Neman. Our Torah tradition is from one shepherd. In other words, while maybe in other lands, maybe in Germany, maybe in France, there are many Rishonim, and they have traditions from various Rabbeim. Us here in Spain, we've received our tradition from one rabbi. Gadol Yada B'chol V'uman. His hand is great in every discipline. He's an uman. He's skilled. Boirer Oicha Mitach Psoilas. He's able to extract the good concepts from the refuse. Seichel Neman. He has trustworthy seichel. You know, there are a lot of people who are very smart, and they don't have any common sense. You know, I know people like that. They're brilliant. They're book smart, but they don't have common sense. So the Ramban has this unique combination of chachma and seichel. Ta'amu kol shoymei dvarav toiv ta'aman. Anyone who tastes, you say I gave away the secret already, because he doesn't say who we're talking about, right? Ta'amu kol shoymei dvarav toiv ta'aman. All those who taste his words, taste the delectability of his offerings. Kinimukai, that means it's deep. And who is he? Interesting, the Ritva paraphrases the pasuk in Parshas B'Shalach. You know, when that food came down from heaven, and they didn't know what it was called. So what they call it, Vayikru Shemai Man. Well, this rabbi, Vayikru es Shemai Man. His name was Man. What does that mean? His name was Man. Moshe ben Nachman. So Vayikru Shemai Man. So interesting. So the Sfarad was different than any other land, and that is all the Rishonim, the Rashba, the Ritva, the Ra'ah, the Ran, Rabbeinu Yoina. They all had the tradition from the Gadol of the Rishonim. Who is that? The Ramban. It's an amazing thing. All of Chachmei Sfarad, they all stem from the Ramban. Now, who did the Ramban learn from? Now, Ramban, let's just start by saying he was a remarkable personality. First of all, he began his career at a very young age. He started writing his Chidushim at 15 years old. Imagine, the Ramban was 15 years old. Now, he followed the protocol of the Rif. The Rif wrote a summary of the halachas of the Gemara. So if you open up a Gemara, you look in the back of the Gemara, and the back of the Gemara is the Rif. The Rif basically summarizes the halachic aspects of the Gemara. Interestingly, when the Rosh, who was from Germany, came to Spain, he was not happy that in Spain they're just busy learning the Rif without learning the Shakla V'Tarya of the Gemara. In the Chachmei Ashkenaz were very sharp. They were trained in the sharp analysis, which you don't necessarily get by knowing the halacha. You only develop by the question-answer process. So the Rosh sort of criticized the focus on the Rif's, the focus on what the Rif wrote. But the Ramban at age 15 noticed that the Rif only wrote halachos on most of Shas. He left out Hilchos Nadarim and Hilchos B'chayros, and the Ramban completed the Rif on B'chayros and Nadarim. So the Ramban is called the great defender of the Rishonim. Whenever there were early Rishonim that were later challenged, the Ramban always came to their defense. For example, the Ramban wrote the Hasagos Ramban on the Sefer Halachos Gedolos. Who wrote Sefer Halachos Gedolos? The Smag. So on the Sefer Halachos Gedolos, the Smag wrote Sefer Halachos Gedolos. The Rambam would attack the Smag, and who defends the Smag? The Ramban. The Ramban defends the Smag. Or the Rif. You look on any Rif, on the bottom of the Rif you have the Baal Hamor. So the Baal Hamor is the Razah. Who defends the Rif from the Razah? The Milchamois, the Ramban. Or for example, the Rif was challenged by Ravid. There are a number of Ravids. By Ravid the third. Again, the Ramban and Sefer HaZchus defends the Rif. So Ramban is known as the great defender. Whenever there were early Rishonim that were challenged, Ramban always jumped to their defense. Okay, let's start it this way. Where did the Ramban learn? Who did the Ramban get this from? So Ramban in Masechta Makos, Daf Beis Amud Aleph, he gives us a little clue. You can look on your sheet number 2. He says, Pshat and Edom Zoymimim, and he says, Kach Peirosh Moirai Rabbi Yehuda. So explains my Rabbi Yehuda. Now that really doesn't give us too much information. There are a lot of Jews named Yehuda, and many of them are rabbis, you know. The Ramban on Psachim, he talks about Hallel, Hallel, not the day after election day, Hallel on the night of Pesach. So the night of Pesach, do you say Hallel with a bracha? So the Ramban says, Kibalti Moiri Rabbi Yehuda, my rabbi, Rabbi Yehuda, has a tradition. So again, he's citing his Rabbi Yehuda. But we don't exactly know who this Rabbi Yehuda is. So amazingly, if you look in the Shita Mekubetzes, in Masechta Bava Basra, the Shita Mekubetzes on Daf Pei Beis writes, the Ramban once said over a pshat, in the name of his Rebbe, Rav Yehuda Bar Yakar. So now we've identified the Rebbe of the Ramban is Rabbeinu Yehuda Bar Yakar. That's Rebbe number 1. He had another Rebbe. So for example, the Ramban in Masechta Shvuos, the Ramban says that he had a Rebbe, Rav Nasan ben Rav Meir. He also refers to him in one of his letters in Igeras Gimel. So he had these two Rabbeim, Rabbeinu Yehuda Bar Yakar and Rabbeinu Nasan Bar Meir. Now the Ramban was a baki, of course, in the halachic aspect of Torah. But anyone who learns the Parsha Ramban and Chumash notices the Ramban also specialized in Kabbalah. Now it was rare for Rishonim to be into Kabbalah because the Zohar HaKadosh had not been discovered yet. So how would the Ramban have a tradition of Kabbalah? Who did he learn from? So we know there were many Rishonim who were into Kabbalah. Let's say the Ravid and the Ravid's son, Rabbi Yitzchak Sagi Nohar. So interesting, in the Rikanti, we're going to get to the interest, just bear with me. See, the Rikanti, one of the Sfarim, one of the Italian Rishonim, wrote by the name of Menachem Rikanti. He lived from 1250 to 1310. He wrote a Kabbalistic work on the Torah. By the way, does anybody know who wrote a Perush on the Rikanti? The Levush. The Levush wrote a Perush on the Rikanti. The Rikanti gives us an idea in Parshas Nosai about Berchas Kohanim, a Kabbalistic idea. And he says, Rikanti says, where did I get this from? He says, this pshat I heard from Rabbi Yitzchak. Rabbi Yitzchak was the son of the Ravid. And then he tells us the following. Listen to this. One of the Rishonim was Rabbeinu David. Rabbeinu David was an Av Bezdin. He learned Kabbalah. Where did he get Kabbalah from? Rabbeinu David had Gilui Eliyahu Hanavi. Okay, so Rabbeinu David, one of the Rishonim, he had Gilui Eliyahu. His son was the Ravid, Rabbi Avram ben David. Says the Rikanti, he learned Kabbalah from his father Rabbeinu David. The Ravid also had Gilui Eliyahu. He gave it over to his son, Rabbi Yitzchak Sagi Nahar. Now, if anyone's been listening to the Shiur, you have to go back many years. One time we quoted Rabbi Yitzchak Sagi Nahar. Rabbi Yitzchak Sagi Nahar wrote a small kuntris on Ner Chanukah. It's published only in the Sefer HaZikaron of Rav Hutner. So now this Rabbi Yitzchak Sagi Nahar was blind, but not like nowadays. Nowadays somebody is 80 years old, they tell him they're blind and you can't drive. Not legally blind. He never saw light in his life. He never saw b'chlal anything in his life. He also had Gilui Eliyahu. In other words, the only thing he ever saw in his life was Eliyahu Hanavi. This Rabbi Yitzchak Sagi Nahar gave it over to two of his Talmidim, Rabbeinu Ezra and Rabbeinu Azriel. Rabbeinu Ezra and Rabbeinu Azriel were the Rebbe of the Ramban. In what? In Kabbalah. So Ramban actually had two different Messiahs. He had a Messiah in Halacha from Rabbi Yehuda Bar Yakar and Rav Nassan Bar Meir, and he had two Rabbeim in Kabbalah, Rabbeinu Azriel and Rabbeinu Ezra. So you say, who's Rabbi Ezra? I never heard of Rabbi Ezra. There is one Tosfos in Shas who quotes Rabbi Ezra, and Tosfos gives Rabbi Ezra a title that no Rishon was ever given. He's given the title Navi. Amazing thing. Tosfos in Masechta Shavuos and Av Chav Hei, Hiksha Rabbeinu Ezra Hanavi. Who's Rabbeinu Ezra Hanavi? He's the Rebbe of the Ramban in Kabbalah. The Ramban's Rebbe in Kabbalah. Okay. So now, fasten your seatbelts. I'll tell you a little bit about the Ramban. So we could always count on the Chida to bring us, some kind of mystical idea about the Ramban. So he quotes Rav Chaim Vital. And of course there's an idea that all the neshamas were in Adam Rishon. Some people were in Adam Rishon's mind. Some people were on his nose. I know people who were probably between his toes, You never know. And where was the Ramban in Adam Rishon? He was on the right side of the beard of Adam Rishon. Interesting. The Ramban was on the right side of the beard of Adam Rishon. And since the beard, says Rav Chaim Vital, is Koyach Hadin, that's why it took the Ramban time to accept Kabbalah. In his youth, he didn't believe in Kabbalah until his Rebbe, Rabbeinu Azriel, showed him a trick. He showed him Kfitzas Haderech, and then the Ramban accepted Kabbalah. Says the Chida, not only did the Ramban's Rabbeim have Gilui Eliyahu, the Ramban himself had Gilui Eliyahu Hanavi Zachar Latek. Okay. So, with that introduction, let us begin. We're not going to learn all the biographical information about the Ramban, but we're going to focus on this one episode, which we call Disputation in Barcelona, which was an epic debate that the Ramban had. So you have to realize when this took place. The Ramban was already an old man. He had already completed many of his works. He was in the middle of writing his commentary on Chumash, and he had almost finished completing his Hasagos on the Rambam. And suddenly this responsibility was cast upon the Ramban at the end of his life, something that he writes and laments about. So if you actually look at the end of the Ramban's commentary, the Sefer HaMitzvos, the Ramban laments the fact that he says, if God would give me long life and sweet older years, I would write another perush on the Sefer HaMitzvos. But he says, right now my mouth is muzzled from embarking on a new commentary on the Sefer HaMitzvos. Now, why was the Ramban's mouth muzzled? Well, what happened was, in the year 1263, so just to take yourself back to the year 1263, it was before you were born, and before Democrats and Republicans, before the United States of America, and we're going back to the Iberian Peninsula, medieval times, and the king of Spain at the time was what's in this sefer we'll talk about in a minute was King Yaakov, but his name was King James of Aragon, who was basically a very wise king, smart king. He had a relationship with the Ramban. He accorded him great honor, but like most people at the time, he was completely brainwashed by the Christian church, but beyond that, he was somewhat of a puppet to the Christian church. In other words, as great of a king as he was and as powerful as he was, ultimately he was subservient and nichna to the Christian church. And they had this grandiose idea, which we'll see where this idea came from. Always we have a rule, Machrivayich, Marsayich, Mimech Yetzeu, that all of our contesters and detractors, they're usually Jews. You know, a guy, there's a limited amount of damage a guy could incur on us. Usually it comes from Yidden who deviate or apostates, and we're going to see, in fact, the idea of this debate was initiated by a Jewish apostate, and we're going to use an expression now, Shehekdiach Tavshiloi. What does it mean, Shehekdiach Tavshiloi? He burnt the pot. What does that mean, he burnt the pot? The Gemara Masechta Brachas Daf Yud Zayin Amud Beis, the Gemara says that a Talmud who goes off, it's considered Shehekdiach Tavshiloi. He burnt his dish. In other words, he deviated. He went off the derech. His name was Pablo Christiani, or his name, what is referred to as Fry Paul, or in English we call it Friar Paul, right? So we'll see in a moment. Now, this debate that the Ramban had was not the first debate that the Ramban ever faced. So we're going to give a few examples of little snippets from writings of the Ramban, where the Ramban, throughout his career, was often faced with challenges and questions from Christian counterparts that the Ramban sort of had to address. For example, I think this year is going to be 2 parts. I'm not sure when the second part will be. Either we'll do it Shabbos or we'll do it next Wednesday. We know one of the main absurdities of Christianity is what they call the Shilosh, the Trinity. And they like to bring a proof because it says, Naseh Adam, Naseh, let us make man. And the Ramban writes in his drasha, Torah Hashem Tamima, look at number 11, the Ramban writes, Naseh Adam, this was a question that this Ha'uma HaMeshubeshes, this corrupted, this degenerate, confused nation always asked me to explain them this pasuk. So we see the Ramban was, even in the past, faced with such challenges. Or he writes how elsewhere in his drashas, how the Christians, they don't know how to interpret the pasuk of Anochi Hashem Lecha Asher Hoitzesicha Me'eretz Mitzrayim. They don't count that as one of the mitzvahs. So then they have the dilemma. So what are the Aseres HaDibros? So Ramban says they have to break up Leisach Moed into 2. And says Ramban, I tried explaining this to them, that they don't know what they're talking about. I try to answer them Lefi Miyut Yediaschem, based on their limited knowledge and based on their very low level of analytic ability. So Ramban sort of derogatorily speaks about their intellectual capacity. Before we start the debate, I want to tell you a story. The story appears at least in 2 places with small discrepancies. And the first place that it appears is the Sefer Shalshelas HaKabbalah. Shalshelas HaKabbalah was written by Rav Gedalia ben Yechia. Now, I think we mentioned in the past, the Chida is not a fan of the Sefer Shalshelas HaKabbalah. He writes that you can't really, we don't consider what's written there necessarily authentic, but it's an old Sefer written by a great Talmud Chacham. And this is a story you're probably all familiar with, that the Ramban had a Talmud. His name was Avner. Once upon a time his name was Rabbi Avner. And Rabbi Avner basically, something happened. He woke up on the wrong side of the bed and he went off the derech. And eventually he rose to greatness with a different religion, presumably Christianity. And one day, Rabbi Avner, in a moment of tremendous venom, he summons the Ramban, and he says, Ramban, and I'll show you, actually in the Sefer Kaveh Yashar, he adds a detail that it was Yom Kippur. It wasn't just a regular day, it was Yom Kippur. And the Kaveh Yashar adds a detail, this Rabbi Avner, we'll see, the Shalshelas HaKabbalah also writes, Rabbi Avner, or now his name is Avner, he takes a pig, and he shechs it. According to Kaveh Yashar, he does nichor, in other words, an invalid shchita, and he eats the pig on Yom Kippur in front of the Ramban, and he says, Rabbi, how many krisos was I just over? So Ramban says 4, probably, Yom Kippur, and, Nevela. and dam and chela v'chveis, what the four were. And he said, no, you missed one, Rabbi, 5. And the Ramban, according to Shashal, gave him like a nasty look, and he got scared. And according to the Kavayashar, the Ramban was moided to him, whatever the details were. So Ramban says, what happened to you? Why'd you go off? He said, Rabbi, let me tell you, it was your fault. So Ramban says, what did I do? So he said, Rabbi, you gave a shiur on Parshas Hazinu, and you said every Jewish tragedy and every vicissitude and every personal difficulty that anyone experiences is alluded to in Parshas Hazinu. And I didn't believe it. I thought it was like hyperbole. I thought it was exaggerated. There's no way that everything is in Parshas Hazinu. And the Ramban says, what are you talking about? I still maintain my position that everything is in Parsha Hazinu. So he said, no, come on, you're kidding me. The Ramban said, ask me any question. So he said, really? Where am I in Parsha Hazinu? So the Ramban says, where are you? So Ramban goes into the corner and he prays and he davens. And min hashamayim, the following pasuk comes to him. Look at number 14. Amarti afehem ashbisa me'enosh zichram. Literally, amarti, I said, afehem. Rashi there says, Alashna peah. I said I would scatter them, make them peah. Ashbisa me'enosh zichram. I would cease their memory to be remembered. In other words, I would cease their memory. Says the Ramban, take the third letter of each word in this pasuk. Reish, Aleph, Beis, Nun, Reish, Rabbi, Avner. That's a remez to you, pal. Here you are in Parshas Hazinu. So Avner was very shaken up. He said, Rabbi, is there any tikkun for my neshama? So Ramban says, look in the pasuk. It says your memory will forever be ceased. So the pasuk says, he took a boat without a malach. What's a malach? A sailor. And he just let the wind take him. And no one ever heard of him again, and his memory ceased. Interesting, the Kavayosher adds that he came to the Ramban in a dream. Because the Ramban prayed for him. And he said, Rabbi, you saved my life. You should know, because of you, I have a much better fate in Olam Haba. Because of you, now I went to Gehenna. So Ramban says, why is that a good thing? He said, because before you came along, I was in the Kaf HaKela. You know, Kaf HaKela is they put you in a slingshot and they shoot you back and forth. And it's not pleasant. It's not a good thing. It's worse than Gehenna. So says Avner, until you came along, I was B'Kaf HaKela. Then you came along, they put me in Gehenna for 12 months. Then I got out. They don't want to put me in Gan Eden, but at least I have a better fate. I don't know why it came to my head, but my grandmother wrote in her memoirs of the Holocaust that when the Nazis came into her city, she lived in the city of Sakhachev. Her father, my great-grandfather, Hashem Yimkom Damai, was Rav of the city, the last Rav of the city of Sakhachev. And the first thing the Nazis did when they came in, the SS officer came, busted the front door, and they had the Nazi came in holding a big pan full of blood with a pig's liver in it. He slammed it down on the Zayda's Bezdin table. There was a white tablecloth. The blood splattered everywhere, and they said, Rabbi, is paskin on this? Is it kosher or treif? That's what the SS officer told him. Paskin on it. Liver in blood, there's no way it's ever kosher. Pig's liver, he was mocking him, and sort of that was the beginning of the end for the Jews of Sakhachev. But here, okay. Anyway, this is the story of Avner. Lamaisa, this story is not brought down anywhere in the writings of the Ramban, but some suggest that the Ramban in the Sefer HaGeula happens to make note of the fact that everything that ever will transpire is alluded to in Parshas Hazinu, and he gives the following example. If you look at number 16 in the Ramban Sefer HaGeula, Kegoin Amarti Afehem Ashbisa Meyenosh Zichram. Of all the psukim in Parsha Hazinu, the Ramban says that alludes to Jewish tragedy, he happens to pick out this pasuk. Okay. Why do I tell you this story? Probably the greatest expert in the Ramban was a rabbi by the name of Rav Shavel, or in the world of academia is known as Rabbi Dr. Charles B. Shavel. Right? For example, you ever look in the Pirush Ramban, the Mosad Rav Kook Ramban is annotated by Rabbi Shavel. or the Kisvei Ramban, is annotated by Rabbi Shmuel, or Rabbeinu Bechaye, or Kisvei Rabbeinu Bechaye, or Rashi, the Mosader Kook Rashi, or the Mosader of Kook Divrei David of the Taz. These are all annotated by Rabbi Shmuel. But besides that, he also translated into English the Ramban al Torah even before art school. Can you imagine? Even before art school, he translated it, and he also translated many other works. He also wrote the official biography on the Ramban, and the name of it is called Rabbeinu Moshe ben Nachman. So, sounds like a good name for a biography on the Ramban. And he writes in his description of this discourse, of this disputation, which we're about to learn from, he says that the Ramban actually had previous disputations with this Fray Paul, or Pablo Christiani, and the exact dating. So interesting. When did this discourse take place? When did this disputation take place? It took place in the year 1263, and he gives us the dates. The exact dates that this disputation took place was Chaf July, the 20th of July, the 27th of July, the 30th of July, the 31st of July. It took place over 4 days. I believe, we looked it up today, the 20th of July in the year 1263 was Hey Av. So even though the debate did not actually take place on Tisha B'Av, but it was in the Zman, it was not in an ominous time for the Jewish people. Now this Pablo Christiani, he was from Montpellier, and one thing that we're going to see from this debate was this was not just a debate between the Ramban and Pablo Christiani. As we're going to see, the king is sitting there. It's under the auspices of King James of Aragon, and he will chime in upon occasion, and the Ramban very diplomatically has to sort of tell the king, hey, this is not part of the deal. We're going to see the Ramban says, look, my arrangement is, I'm debating him, I can't talk to you, king. Because to talk to the king, to debate the king, is a lose-lose situation. You can't win with the king. So we're going to see the Ramban, so to speak, when the king chimes in, he says, look, I'm not talking to you. Another amazing thing is, let's just think for a moment, the Ramban recorded this debate in a sefer called Sefer HaVikuach. We'll see exactly what the correct name of it is. There is no way the Ramban debated this Pablo Christiani in the presence of the king in Lashon HaKodesh. There's no way the king understood Lashon HaKodesh. So what language do you think the Ramban debated Pablo in? Probably in the language used by the Catholic Church, which was Latin. It was assumed that it was Latin. Also because Pablo was maybe from France. What? Yeah, but he spoke Hebrew, but the king didn't speak Hebrew. And for example, we're going to see, besides the king, you know who else was there? Harosh Hamasader Hadominikini Hakoyin Va'Nazar. Who's that? The head of the head monk of the Dominican order. So he's basically the highest ranking Christian official. Now we're going to see that it's amazing when the Ramban begins the debate, he basically says, Bershus the king and Bershus Ramon di Fanforti. Saying, if you're sitting in front of the king, you don't say, Bershus the king and Bershus Joe Schmo. If he's invoking the name of Ramon di Fanforti, then obviously this guy was somebody to reckon with. And we're going to see that in a way, King James of Aragon was really submissive to this Ramon. Because Ramon tells Ramban, wait a second, make sure anything you say is not insulting to us. So what we're going to see is that the king was more of a puppet figure on behalf of the church.
You forced him to get the Ramban to answer some questions that are not at the front.
Okay. So it's just to point out, it's presumed that the Ramban debated this Pablo in Latin, which means I don't think we ever think of it this way. The Ramban was then obviously fluent in Latin, able to converse in Latin, able to debate publicly in Latin with complete conviction, with complete confidence, which is quite a remarkable idea to think of. One of the Rishonim was so fluent in one of these classic languages. Okay, so Marav Rabbi Sai, I'm going to point out that one thing that we see from this debate is here the Ramban is under tremendous pressure. It's a lose-lose situation. On the one hand, he can't just give in, he can't cave in, he can't say, yeah, you're right. It would be tremendous chilul Hashem to admit to any of their arguments. On the other hand, if he fights valiantly, he's risking his life. He's risking the life of the entire Jewish people. And yet, the Ramban is able to, so to speak, toe the line. He's able to fight with bravery, with courage. And on the other hand, we're going to see he does it very politely, with tremendous musar. And we're going to point that out. And obviously he had tremendous siyata d'shmaya. So we said the name of this sefer is called Sefer HaVikuach of the Ramban. But if you look in the Chidah, in the Shem HaGadolim, the Chidah and the Shem HaGadolim lists all the Sfarim that were ever written before his time. The Chidah actually gives this compilation a different name. He calls it Melchemes Chayva. Okay. Mo'av Rabbi Sai, I'm going to teach you a Gemara now. You don't have to raise your hand. I'm sure there are people in this room that have learned Shas. And we're going to learn a Gemara that no one in this room ever learned. You know why? Because it's not in Shas anymore. It was taken out of Shas. But it was originally part of Shas. It's from a Gemara the Ramban had. It was such a Gemara, Rashi even wrote Perush on it. They took out the Gemara and they took out Rashi's Perush. And that's how the Ramban begins Sefer HaVikuach. It's a little bit mysterious what he's trying to do with it. The gist of the Gemara is, it's a Gemara that belonged in Sanhedrin, Mem Gimel Amud Beis. And the Gemara begins that Yeshu had 5 Talmidim. And their names were Masoi, Nikai, Neitzer, Buni, and Toida. And the government wanted to kill Masai. And his friend said, how could you kill Masai? Masai, it says in the Torah, Masai Avoi Ve'ira Pnei Elokim. So the government said back, what are you talking about? There's another pasuk that says, Masai Yamos Va'avad Shemai. And then they wanted to kill Naki. And his friend said, how could you kill Naki? It says, Naki v'tzadik al taroig. And they said back, what are you talking about? It says, Amrale, we have to kill Naki. It says, B'mistarim yehareg Naki. And there was this debate where they tried to defend from being killed Yeshu's Talmidim, and they said back, no, we found another pasuk that says this word in the context of killing. For example, one of these chevra, their name was Toida. So they said, how could you kill Toida? It says, Mizmar l'Soida. And they said, what are you talking about? It says, Zoiveach Toida yechabedonani. Whoever shechs Toida is honoring me. Says the Ramban, what we see from here, and Rashi says, amazing, the Ramban quotes a Rashi on a Gemara that we don't have the Gemara, we don't have the Rashi. And the Ramban says these people were close to the Malchus, and they needed to disprove and refute all of their tainas. So from here the Ramban says, I learned that when dealing with this Russia, Pablo Christiani, I needed to slug up, I needed to demonstrate the falsehood of all of his tainas. So Ramban tells us sort of the backdrop of the story over here. And the way he wrote the Sefer HaVikuach, he wrote it with paragraphs so you could follow along. We're going to do some of it tonight and hopefully other part of it on another occasion. The Ramban, look at number 20.
Divided by day, no? Every day
No. So here he divided it just by like chapters, by paragraphs. So in paragraph Beis, in number 20, the Ramban writes that the king commanded me to debate Fray Paul in his palace in Barcelona. And the Ramban says, this is what I told the king. I'm willing to do this on one condition. On condition that I have freedom of speech. Right? The Ramban says, not like in America, that only liberals have freedom of speech. Conservatives don't have freedom of speech. No. The Ramban says, not like in America. I want absolute freedom of speech. So, the king says, no problem. But Ramon, the Fino Forte, said, provided that you don't embarrass us. Ramban says, what do you mean, provided I don't embarrass you? If you are able to speak freely, then I need to be able to speak freely. It has to be equal footing. Certainly, says Ramban, I will be respectful. Certainly, I will be courteous and polite. But I cannot be hampered. I cannot be limited in what I'm allowed to talk about. And they honored that request of the Ramban. Says the Ramban, look, over the years, the Christians and Jews argued over many points. Most of the things they argued about were ancillary, were not fundamental. So the Ramban said, I'm not here today to say, you Christians hold we shouldn't say the second Yom Kippur, and we hold you should say the second Yom Kippur. That's not what we're here to talk about today. We're here to talk about the fundamentals of religion. For example, we want to know, first we're going to talk about the fundamental difference between Judaism and Christianity. You claim Mashiach came, and we say Mashiach has yet to come. And then we're going to talk about Mashiach. Is he a man, or is he a God? And then we're going to talk about who has the right religion. So, Fry Paul in Ois Zion says, Ramban, I'm here today to prove that the sages of your, this is very interesting, the sages of your Talmud, of your Gemara, they believed Mashiach came already. They believed in the Yozel, in Mr. Cheese and Crackers, JC, right? They believed in him. So the Ramban says, really? You're telling me that our sages believed that the Yozel was Mashiach? Well, how's that possible? And the Ramban says, look, Fry Paul, I've heard you've gone around Provence making this claim that the sages of the Talmud believed in Yeshua HaNotzri. But let's get something straight. When did Yeshua HaNotzri live? Now we're going to see also an important thing. He didn't live, I bet you, if I would ask you, when was Yeshua born and when did he die? So I bet everyone in this room would say, well, he died obviously in the year 0, right? That's only if you're a Christian you believe that. The Jews do not believe that. So when do we believe he lived? Nowhere near then. There's a major machlokes between the Rishonim and Christian historians when he lived. We don't accept he lived in that year. We believe he lived kemat 100 years earlier. Okay, we're going to see that. Ramban's going to write. It's not factual that he lived and died then. He died clearly a young man. He was killed a young man by the Romans. He did not die then. Not in the year 0, not in the year 1, not in the year 2, not in the year 3. Probably he died about 200 years before the Churban Beis Hamikdash. We can see black and white in the Ramban. That is the tradition of Klal Yisrael. So it's Kedai here just to come. Most people are not familiar with that. The Ramban says, so one second. You're telling me that our Chachamim of the Talmud believed in that Mashiach came? So let's talk about that for a second. The Tanoim lived, some of them lived at the end of the second Beis Hamikdash. Some of them lived after the second Beis Hamikdash, right? Which Tanoim lived after the second Beis Hamikdash? Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi, and then you had the sages of the Talmud, Ravina, Rav Ashi. Now, when did Rav Ashi complete the Talmud?
5th century, no?
So, Rav Ashi died in the year 4186, which is 356 years after the Churban. The Ramban writes the Talmud was composed about 400 years after the Churban, because the truth is, even though Rav Ashi died 356 years after the Churban, he did not finish the Talmud. His Talmidim, about 73 years later, finished the Talmud. So Ramban says, well, wait a second, Fry Paul. You're telling me the sages of the Talmud believed in Yozel? What kind of lunacy is that? What kind of idiocy is that? So if they believed in him, why were they practicing Jews? Why did they keep Torah mitzvahs? Why were they shomer Torah mitzvahs? Says the Ramban, if they believed that he was Mashiach, why would they have lived and died observant, practicing Jews? Why didn't they shmad themselves like you did, Pablo? Obviously, clearly, they didn't believe in him. They lived as Jews, and they died as Jews. And says the Ramban, the definition of a Jew is to follow Talmud Bavli. And therefore, we follow their example. If they, who did not live so long after cheese and crackers, they didn't accept him, so then why should we accept him? So, Pablo Christiani's response to that was, that's a long-winded argument. Who could even understand such a thing? You see how clear the Ramban is arguing, so he gave some kind of nonsensical knockoff. Then Fry Paul sort of turns to the Ramban and he says, I don't understand you. What do you do for a living, Ramban? He says, what do you mean? I'm a rabbi. He said, Rabbi? What do you mean you're a rabbi? Look in the Gemara. Smicha stopped in the times of Yehuda ben Bava. You have no right to call yourself rabbi. Now, does anybody know what did rabbis call themselves in Spain in the times of the Rishonim? They were called, Rav was called maestro. He says, maestro? You're not a maestro. You don't have smicha dating back to Moshe Rabbeinu. So very interesting, the Ramban responds like this. Ramban says, what does that have to do with our debate? Now you're getting off on a tangent. This is not Simzach. You're not talking Simzach over here. Why? What are you bringing this up for? There's nothing to do with what we're discussing. But let me answer you. Let me respond to you. I don't call myself Rebbe. I'm not a Rebbe, because Rebbe you have to have smicha. I call myself Rav. Even in the times of the Gemara, the Amoram who did not have smicha called themselves Rav. I'm calling myself Rav. I don't call myself Rebbe. But then the Ramban says something very interesting. But he says the truth is, what am I? Ani moideh ki eini maestro. I'm not a real maestro. And I'm not even a good student. And the Ramban says, why did I tell this to him? Amarti zeh b'derech musar. I told this to him as derech eretz. So, in other words, he was saying it as a sign of humility. I'm not a real rabbi. I'm not a real chacham. I'm not a real scholar. So, we learn something very important from here. Here the Ramban is arguing with this apostate about fundamentals of religion. He's trying to persuade him. It's not really the time to be self-effacing or to be humble or to be... But even so, we see from the Ramban that no matter how unworthy your opponent is, no matter how despicable your opponent is, no matter how loathsome your opponent is, you always have to show derech eretz and personal musar. And even in the course of a fierce debate about the most important things, you never try to be boastful or self-aggrandizing. The Ramban, even in such a situation, he still maintained this guideline of musar and anivos. Okay. Well, there's still more we have to see. Give me 10 more minutes. It will be good. Okay. So the next argument was predicated on the following medrash. It's a medrash in Eicha Rabbah, Parsha Aleph, Ois Nun Aleph. It's a well-known medrash, but this is a medrash that the challengers of the Torah, they like to jump upon. The medrash says like this. It's in number 22. The medrash says, there was once a guy and he was plowing. And his ox started to low. What does low mean? The ox lowed. Lowed.
Like move, like.
He started to, right.
Like a move.
Like a moo. Very good, Alvin. Cows moo, oxen low. The ox started to talk. And an Arab passed by. And the Arab said to the Jew, what are you? He said, I'm a Jew. He said, you're a Jew? Huh. Unleash your ox, unleash the plow. He said, why? He said, because your Beis HaMikdash was just destroyed. So he says to the Arab, how do you know? He said, I speak ox talk. I heard the ox say the Beis HaMikdash was just destroyed. While the Jew was untying the ox, the Arab said, tie it back up. He said, why? Because your ox lowed again. Yeah, and so he said Mashiach was just born. So Zogt the Meshumed Fry Paul. So you see from the Medrash that Mashiach came already. You see on the day that the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed, Mashiach was born. So the Ramban says something that he says in Ois Chaf, and he says in Ois Lametes, something I don't want to get into. Now, I think in giving the shiur all the years, 7 years, this is the second time that I ever said I don't want to get into something. I never shied away from a topic. The first time we did it off camera. This one we're not even doing off camera. The Ramban says something very, very interesting in response to this. He says, I don't believe in that. And he spells it out much more clear in Ois Lametes. So for you Talmidei Chachamim out there, or you scholars out there, if you want to investigate this topic more, I refer you to Ois Chaf and Ois Lametes, as well as the Haggadah number 28, where he quotes the opinion of Rav Yosef Shal Levi Natanzon. And if you want to talk about it privately, I would be happy to discuss with you.
For the discussion, because
No. It's not for public consumption. But for those who want to learn it and those who want to know, you could investigate yourself, and there's something very interesting there, and there's great debate about what the Ramban means. But the bottom line is, the upshot is, doesn't this Medrash say that Mashiach came already? So Ramban says like this. Even if you want to accept this medrash at face value, it doesn't prove. You want to say Mashiach came, but it disproves your notion, because this is a medrash, and the medrash is saying, when was Mashiach born? When the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed. When was the Beis Hamikdash destroyed? 70 CE, 68 CE, which is 70 years after you claim cheese and crackers lived. Your Yoizel lived. So the medrash is not a refutation for me; it's a refutation to you, because there's no way that this medrash refers to your cheese and crackers. And the Ramban says that's according to your tradition, and according to my tradition. The Ramban writes, I want you to see this in Ois Chav Beis. Leidasai karov l'masayim shana koydem achorben. JC was born about 200 years before the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash. To be precise, the tradition of the Jewish people is that he was born in the year
130 BC.
He was born 157 years before the Churban. So that takes you about to the year 87 before the Common Era. Okay, so it's interesting to know. We live in a Christian world. There's so many ideals and facts that we say, yeah, of course, just because we've basically been brainwashed by the country we grew up in. But we happen to have our own independent Messiah on when certain things happen. Okay. Then, another very interesting argument. Look in the Gemara in Sanhedrin, Daf Tzadi Ches Amud Beis. Okay. Says the Gemara, it's a famous Gemara, Rabbi Shiur ben Levi went to Eliyahu Hanavi and he said, Eliyahu, when's Mashiach coming? So Eliyahu said, what do you want from me? Why don't you ask him? So Rabbi Shiur ben Levi says, what do you mean ask him? Where does he hang out? So Rabbi Lo says, what do you mean? Apischa de karta, by the opening of the gate. By the way, the Vilna Gaon changes the girsa from Apischa de karta to Apischa de Roimi, the opening of the gate of Rome. When I was there, I looked for him. We didn't find him. But the Gemara says he hangs out in the opening of the gate of Rome, and he hangs out among the poor, and he's tying his bandages, he's untying his bandages. So it says Fry Paul, here the Gemara is saying very clearly, what? Mashiach came already. So look, your Chachamim, Eliyahu Hanavi and Rabbi Shiur ben Levi, they say Mashiach came. Ramban says you don't know how to read a Gemara, you weren't paying attention in 5th grade. They asked Eliyahu, where is Mashiach? Eliyahu says he's in the gates of Rome. So they asked him, when is he coming? In other words, the Gemara is saying he did not come yet. The Gemara doesn't say it came. It says that's where he's sitting. But he didn't come yet. And again, says Ramban, that's written in the times of Amoram, well after the death of when you claim the Mamzer lived. So the king says like this. King says, I have a Shiloh, Nachmanides. And this is really, to me, this is the highlight of this first part of the debate. The king says to Nachmanides, wait a second, if he was born in the time that the Midrash says, at the time of the Churban Beis Hamikdash, and he didn't come yet, so that means he's now like 1100 years old, right? Because think about it. If the Midrash says he was born at the time that Beis Hamikdash was destroyed, and he still didn't come yet, that would make Mashiach like 1100 years old. Ramban says, yeah, exactly. What's the problem? The king says, look, nobody could live that long. People die 100 years, 200 years. Ramban says, you admit Adam HaRishon lived 930 years. You believe Mr. Shalach lived close to 1,000 years. Says the Ramban, a very interesting thing. Says Ramban, why do people die? Because of the Ched of Adam HaRishon. And what's the job of Mashiach? To bring the world back to the state where before the Ched, before Adam HaRishon. That means Mashiach then is not subject to all the vicissitudes and all the punishments that Adam HaRishon brought to the world. So Adam HaRishon was the one who brought to the world death. That means Mashiach is not subject to death. So the fact, even if you want to accept the Midrash at face value, that what? That Mashiach was born in the time of the Churban Beis Hamikdash, he's still kicking. There's no problem. He's still kicking. So the king says, where is he? The king says, but the Gemara says he was in the gates of Rome. So here's where the Ramban shows his sense of humor. It's very interesting. If you look in number 26 in Ois Lamed Beis, he says, first when the king sort of chimes in and he says, well, where is Mashiach now? You can't live so long. The Ramban says, hey, you're breaking your end of the deal. The deal was that I debate Pablo. I don't debate the king. I didn't ask you. So you see, the Ramban is not afraid to speak up to the king. But he said, once you're asking already, let me tell you. First he says, the king says, so where is he? Ramban says, what, am I the FBI? I don't know where he is. Well, I need to know exactly where Mashiach is. The Ramban says, I have a good idea. Why don't you go to Toledo, send your men to Toledo. Maybe he's in the gates of Toledo. That, the Ramban said, was his big joke to the king. So if you're not laughing, you haven't honed in your sense of humor on the level of the Ramban yet to appreciate medieval humor. He sent him to the gates of Toledo. But moreover, Abaisai, this was the big whopper. By the way, the king said, so where is he, Ramban? Ramban says, Adam Arishon was chased out of Gan Eden. But Mashiach will bring the world back to the level of Adam Arishon before Lech. He's hanging around in Gan Eden. He's allowed entry to Gan Eden. So the king says to Ramban the following. Do you believe in Mashiach? Ramban says, sure. And let me ask you something. Do you believe when Mashiach comes, all the punishments of Adam Arishon will cease? So the king says yes, but a little different than you believe. If you want to look at this is number 30. We believe that Mashiach came already, right? That's Christian theology. We believe Mashiach came. We believe in the Messiah came. And we believe that, in fact, when Yeshu was born and died, he freed the world of the curse of Adam. So Ramban says, is that so? Because if you actually look at the verses, it says in the Torah that what are the curses that Adam brought to the world? Arura ha'adama, the land produces weeds, the land produces thistles, and you have to sweat to earn a living, and you have to die, and women have pain giving in labor and delivery and childbirth. Says the Ramban, you read Parshas Bereshis, and you read all the curses that Adam brought to the world, and none of them stopped. So how could you tell me that when cheese and crackers came down to the world, all the curses stopped? They're all here. Right? Everyone here has to make a living. When a woman gives birth, it hurts, even with all the chemicals that they inject with. It still hurts. So what are you talking about? So the king said, what do you mean? The main curse that Adam brought to the world stopped when Yashka came. The Ramban said, what are you talking about? Which curse? The curse was that until Yashka, when people died, they went straight to Gehenna. They went to the purgatory. And the Yoizel, the Mamzer, freed all of mankind from the purgatory. Ramban said, Azoi, is that so? Where did you get that that's the case? How do you know people went to the purgatory, and how do you know they got out? The Ramban says, this is what we call in our religion, that when you want to lie, you say that the witnesses are overseas, they can't come right now. By the way, it's an expression that you find in Rashi, in Bereshis Rabbah brings it down, and the Rosh in Masechta Shavuos brings it down. Haroitza lekazev yarchek edav. If you want to lie, you bring a proof from something that can never be proven, right? If you want to lie, I'll prove to you that I'm going to jump over the moon because 300 years ago, the East Star disappeared. Oh, really? Mamish, there's a Raya Brura. I can't slug you up. I wasn't around 300 years ago. So the Ramban said, listen to how absurd your religion is. All the curses that are stated in the Old Testament, that women have pain enduring childbirth, and that people die and people have to make a living, all of those curses that we know exist, they still exist, and they haven't lessened up at all. Oh, so how do you faren for the fact that your Mashiach did not stop any of the curses of Adam Rishon? So you make up a Maisa that before he came along, everybody went to a hot place, and you make up an Andra Maisa that when he came along, they all got out. You're right, Mamish Araya Brew. We have no way to disprove you. This is what we call, if you want to lie, you make up a story that cannot be disproven. And at this point, Rabbi Isai, the Ramban tells the king, look, you want to say Mashiach came? And you should know, we'll end with this. I heard this from Victor Miller so many times. I never understood it. And I suspect it must have come from him. I remember as a kid, Rav Miller used to say that somebody who spends their life serving Hashem, learning Torah, tefillah, for them Mashiach came. For them, it's even better than if Mashiach would have come. And I remember he said these words, for Rashi, Mashiach came. And for the Ramban, Mashiach came. And for the Vilna Gaon, Mashiach came. Why? Because what's Mashiach? People think when Mashiach comes, I'm going to have more pleasure. Mashiach is a stender and a Gemara and nobody to interfere. So that's what Rashi had. But Rashi had it even better off. Because when Mashiach comes, there's going to be very little Nesyonis. You're not going to get so much schar. Rashi spent his time learning, and he had Nesyonis, so for him it was even better than Mashiach coming. So Ramban says, you believe Mashiach came? I agree with you. You, king, you're a gracious king, you're a generous king, you don't persecute us. When you're around, for me, it's like Mashiach came. What more do I want? I have my Talmud, I have my studies. When you're around, king, it's like Mashiach came. But then the Ramban says, probably, his most courageous thing yet, in number 31, the Ramban says in the middle of Mem Zayin, Aval Iker Hadin V'Hamachloikish Ben Yehuda Mein Anutz. The main difference between the Jews and the Christians is that you talk about your God in a loathsome, despicable way. You, king, you know why you believe in JC? Because you're brainwashed. Because you grew up among Christians and you heard their nonsense your whole life. And your brain is full of this habitual nonsense. But that which you believe, which is the main tenet of your faith, is so illogical, is so counterintuitive. It does not make any sense. None of our prophets ever said such a thing. And then, why? What is he referring to? Says the Ramban, it is so disgusting and loathsome to say that the creator of heaven and earth, who breathed life into man, could then transform into flesh and blood and pass through the womb of a woman and then develop there for 7 months and be born and then be so weak and so inept and so fragile that he can't, not only does he not bring salvation to himself, he can't even save his own skin. What kind of absurdity is that? And then he goes back to being a God. Says Ramban, Lo Yizbal Das Yehudi, no Jewish mind could ever tolerate such a thing. V'shamadim, no human mind could ever tolerate such a thing. And therefore you speak nonsense. If you'd like to continue the debate, Ramban says, I would be happy to. But every aspect of religion is predicated on sheker v'chazav. Interestingly, if you're not able to hear the end of the shiur, which I recommend that you do, the end of the shiur, the end of the debate, the king turns to Ramban and he says, look, I never saw somebody fight so valiantly and courageously and argue so cogently and logically and be wrong. In other words, the result was a foregone conclusion. Right? It was like they got the questions beforehand. It was like something like the United States. But the king was sort of moida to the fact that he was quite impressed with the way the Ramban performed. Ultimately, the Ramban produced this work, and he published it, and that's what got him into trouble, and he had to eventually flee Spain, and he went to Eretz Yisrael, and we were actually zoicha that the Ramban went to Eretz Yisrael, because that's where he finished his Perush on Chumash. Hopefully we'll finish this up another occasion. Zechusai Yagein Aleinu. Amen.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.